One of our questions was how well the intelligence community, Air Force, and Space Force are working together. About 50% of respondents said that the three groups, the IC, the Air Force, and Space Force, are working moderately effectively. But then roughly 1/3 believe they're either not effective at all or slightly effective in their coordination. Victoria, I'm curious to think if that seems about right. Maybe there's too much optimism. Maybe there's just too much pessimism in that response.
I think probably a lukewarm response is probably the most accurate way to describe, how these organizations are working together. Just because, again, they're coming off of decades of pre-ingrained ways of thinking about things. If nothing else, the poll results indicate that there is definite room for improvement. And one of the probably best ways of doing that is to really make it a priority from leadership on down to make these processes as smooth as possible, as opposed to being concerned about, who gets the budget, who gets the authority, that sort of thing. Just really looking at what is your end mission and what is the best way to go about doing that. And again, I think comes down to what is the ultimate end mission of the Space Force, and really building that brand as opposed to focusing on internecine organizational battles.
The interesting thing is working through that enterprise integration, and that's really the mission focus that maybe that's not necessarily seen. Some of it is seen from inside of the leaders of our nation and Congress and others, but some of these threads run through all of these organizations, and you have to create those opportunities such that these organizations can have those enterprise level discussions and awareness. And that's where we operate from, we as an aerospace. A lot of times we're working with these mission partners and we're working across agencies to help them understand what the complete threat of the mission is and how one organization can benefit or leverage from another. And each parts component is how they play together. That's challenging because they all have their specific purpose and they have their role. And they have their schedule and they have their milestones, but in a grander scheme, there's an integration challenge that we work to get them to all come together. I agree, it's probably a lukewarm response in total. There's a lot of different reasons for any of these groups to come together, but when you look at it on a mission basis, and mission meaning what is it we're trying to do with these capabilities, you begin to see some of the synergies and the interdependencies across these organizations.
I just wanted to point out that one of the key issues is actually defining with more clarity the roles and missions of the various institutions now that Space Force has been established, because there are overlaps and there are not well-defined processes for saying who gets the last word. And that's important. Somebody has to make a decision. If all of these decisions are made by committees and committees and committees, then they're often dependent on personalities and not actually on how best to fulfill the mission. So there has to be some more clarity in roles and responsibilities. And I think you're starting to see a push for that from within Congress.
So it's funny you mentioned Congress. One of the questions we did ask in the poll was about whether the respondents thought Congress should exert more oversight on the space acquisition system or not. And respondents were pretty neutral. We asked them to go 1 through 5, 1 being not so much, 5 being yes, they need to do that. Came back as a 3, so right in the middle. And I think that might reflect a little bit of the people who responded, which were generally people either in the building or in industry, who I think the general response is, hey, we know better than Congress about some of this stuff, and Congress tends to muck things up. McKenna, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the Congress question.
There's been so much attention on the Space Force since before it was even stood up, that they're under a pretty big microscope. So when things aren't moving quite as quickly as people want them to, they're pretty fast to, throw blame on the Space Force and say they're not doing anything. And with the results of the first question, it sounds like the people who are in the Pentagon are more familiar with the tangible successes that the Space Force is having. And I think that, as we get into this conversation with Congress, we need to remember that the Space Force hasn't even been stood up for 2 years yet. So they're going through a lot of growing pains, let alone in a pandemic where everything kind of slowed to a halt anyways. So although, some people in industry and in Congress might not see, the wheels turning as quickly as they wanted to, it doesn't mean that they're just at a standstill. So I think that before, Congress gets even more involved, we might need to give the Space Force just a little bit more time and flexibility to really, get into their groove.